Hey, welcome back to another episode of the Zeal show. This is the show for SEOs and digital marketers that like to get nerdy, technical, and discuss the real strategies that entrepreneurs are using to grow their businesses. I'm your host, Jarod, and today I'm joined by my buddy, Jarod Spiewak. So first things first, man, thanks for coming back on the show now. It's awesome
Yeah,
to have you here.
yeah, of course. It's fun to be back. It's been a couple years.
Yeah, exactly. It's been a long time. For anyone that missed that first interview or doesn't know who you are, do you want to briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Let me try to give the quick intro as best as possible. So, as you said, my name's Jarod Spiewak. I own a marketing agency which I've had for the past almost 3 years now, primarily focusing on SEO. And over the past year, which would be the biggest difference from the last interview for anyone that's listened to that, is we've also dived heavily into Google Ads PPC. But my background is I started freelancing online. I started to did a little bit of corporate marketing, real estate for about a year. Got into working in-house at an agency. Did a lot of white label work for other agencies, and then eventually I had all this freelance work building up. I built a pretty sustainable profile on a platform called UpWork at the time, which is driving just an immense amount of clients and traffic or leads to me. And then eventually we went from that to basically going, okay, great, let's start our own agency. And right around the time that we had our first conversation was in that kind of transition period where I was still working for that other agency a couple hours a week, not too much. And then right after we recorded, probably within 30 days, I was fully on my own and have been ever since.
Yeah, I remember because the title of the episode was like how Jared's making 20K a month from Upwork. And
Yeah.
then 3 weeks later, you're like, hey, I got rid of a bunch of these clients and switching my focus off of Upwork now.
Yeah. So I was doing pretty well with the clients at that point, and then it was just this massive amount of overwhelming because there is such a thing as growing too fast and being too big. And
It's very
what
true. Yeah.
happened was there was honestly this very dark period of my life or time, whatever you want to call it, where I had so many clients and I didn't know what to really do. I didn't have any kind of room to breathe. And so I was renting out this office space, and it was like this nice big office space because I had this like idea that it was going to have like this massive in-house team, which just never happened. And I had kind of no idea what I was doing. So there were times where I was spending 2-3 days at a time just sleeping on the floor of like a thinly carpeted office floors, which anyone who's ever been in office space knows that it's not like high quality carpet. It's as thin as possible. You're basically laying on concrete, just 2-3 days at a time. Sometimes, and it was just like wake up, work for a couple hours, have a couple meetings, sleep for like 90 minutes, and just going back and forth. And it was just incredibly overwhelming. And so fairly quickly after that interview, I went through. I fired maybe about 30% or so of my clients, and then just through kind of being overwhelmed, that ended up me not providing the best service possible to clients. So about another 20% or
Sure.
so
Yeah.
canceled of their own volition. And so it was kind of this like this benefit and this curse at the same time, where all of a sudden my monthly recurring revenue, my MRR, dropped way down very suddenly. But at the same time, it freed me up quite a bit, where I was able to actually sit back and think about, okay, what is my next move? Because beforehand I was just operating, day by day. It was just, okay, great, I have 4 phone calls today. That means I'm probably going to get about 3 new clients. I'm going to build them. We're going to do the work. And then that's it. It was just, get a call, get a client, do the work, without really thinking about, is this the right client? Is this the right move for us? Where are we growing? Where are we kind of going?
Sure. And then you took a complete 180 on that approach. And it was like you became like the automation guy and you became obsessed with systems and how you can automate your work and streamline as much as possible, right?
Right, exactly. And a lot of that was built out of kind of necessity because I didn't know how to uh, really hire. Or I didn't feel very comfortable hiring, and the hiring decisions that I did make were pretty poor. And so what happened was I had more clients than one person could handle, but I didn't have the team to kind of do that work. So I had to
Yeah.
basically figure out, how can I have, uh, how can I make 65 hours worth of work be achievable within 40 hours without hiring someone to do those 15 hours of work. at least at that time. And so what happened is over time, I started to dive into, just how to do things faster through spreadsheets. And then the little bit of programming knowledge I had, how to build some simple scripts or whatever it may be, or build some more complex scripts, just to figure out how can we essentially eliminate time.
Okay. And we can come back to this. I'd love to pick your brain a little on automation, but fast forward a little bit more. So
Mm-hmm.
you went through your automation phase and you got really
Yeah.
good at automating a lot of SEO tasks. At some point, I presume this was kind of a slow addition. You started focusing a lot more on PPC.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about the PPC is that before we really launched it as a service, I studied it for almost 2 years. This
Okay,
because
wow.
I tend to be quite obsessive about these things, and I don't really like to dive in and offer it as a service unless I feel fairly confident with it. Especially because I wanted to dive in and demand fairly high rates for it, rather than have like high rate SEO clients and then work with like bottom of the barrel prices with PPC, which might make sense for some people who are like just getting started. So I really wanted to dive in and be able to have be able to pitch well and be able to demand rates similar to people who'd been doing this for years. So for a while, and even when we were had our last conversation, I had been researching PPC for a while. I had worked on it a little bit every once in a while through freelancing, just like an SEO client being like, hey, here's my ad account, like have fun with it or whatever it may be. So I had a little bit of experience with it, but then I started diving into just listening to a ridiculous amount of podcasts, purchasing a couple of courses on it, taking a bunch of knowledge in through just like general blog posts, YouTube, so on and so forth. And so by the time we actually started taking on PPC clients officially, I had probably already listened to hundreds of hour podcasts, read probably thousands of blog posts, spent a couple $1,000s on courses and whatnot. So I just like absorbed a ridiculous amount of knowledge, and then I was like, okay, great. Now let's apply this in the real world, more so than just the occasional account that we were working with. We worked with a couple accounts, felt pretty good about it, and then we started scaling that within the past year or so. And at this point, we now have probably about double the amount of PPC clients as we have on the SEO side of things. Granted, the rate that we charge them is much lower, so it kind of makes sense on that front. But yeah, it's something that we researched for a while and we just kind of dove right into.
I'm super curious on the PPC side, and we can talk a little about it. I think PPC is great from the business perspective. Never mind the agency and your perspective, but the actual client. I mean, they're going to get way quicker results with PPC as long as you can actually get it profitable, which shouldn't be too hard if it's local type stuff. Speaking from not being an expert at it, you probably know better than me. But it makes more sense to me initially for clients.
Oh, 100%. So something that I say quite often when uh, either on podcasts when I'm talking about SEO and PPC to a less knowledgeable audience, or when I'm talking to prospective clients as well, is I typically say that it honestly makes zero sense to ever invest in SEO before you have a profitable PPC campaign. The reason being is that, as we all know, SEO takes a ridiculous amount of time. And depending on your situation, I mean, don't get me wrong, you can certainly see, great 30-day results if you're in a good place. But depending, I would say on average, you're looking about 6, 8, maybe 12 months. There's sometimes you're working with a client and you're like, hey, you're really far behind. You're looking at 24 months, or maybe they're a little bit faster. And you're like, hey, maybe we can do some cool stuff in 3 months. But at the end of the day, it's going to take time. And then it's going to take time for you to reach profitability with that campaign because you've gone in the red for quite a few months beforehand. But you've spent all this money, you spent all this time, now you rank, and now you're not getting leads if you're in local. It's not converting, or you're getting these leads, but the phone system isn't converting those leads into customers because they're really used to working with referrals, and now that they're getting their own organic leads or paid leads, they don't know how to close them nearly as well. And so what the SEO does is it pre-tests things not only for me but also for them as well, where I can see if their website is a piece of crap and can't convert. I'm going to see that on the PPC side of things, and I'm going to know that if I send SEO traffic to them, that they're going to be mad at me because they're like, hey, why am I getting all these leads? And I'm like, look at all this traffic, but why aren't they converting into leads? Because their website's crap. Or we've had some clients where we sent them a bunch of a bunch of calls or form fills or whatever it may be for that specific client, and they get almost no customers out of it or no clients of their own because their sales team just isn't that good, or they're on jobs themselves and they can't pick up the phone most of the time. So what the PPC does, which is really cool, is that pre-tests everything. It pre-tests the keywords, it pre-tests the business itself, and you can scale it much quicker, as you said, which allows you to start off, you can start off with PPC with a much smaller budget than SEO, figure it out, get some results, then scale the PPC budget, scale it again, and then use the profit from the PPC campaign to then fund the SEO campaign as well, right? Let's say you're spending 5, you're getting 15 out of it. Let's say it's 10 in profit. Take 3 of that 10, put it into the SEO campaign, and now your PPC campaign is paying for the SEO campaign. But that's just
Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
it's something that I go into just because the PPC does work so much faster in some cases, not in 100% of cases.
I was gonna say, because for local, I agree. In most niches, I imagine local definitely. I played around with it a little bit. It's not my area of expertise, but when it gets into something like e-commerce or something like that, I can imagine it can get a lot more competitive.
For sure, yeah. So when it comes to local, it's essentially a guarantee that it will work. It's just a matter of, do you have the time and the budget to get it to work? What I mean by that is most
Sure. Yeah.
local campaigns are fairly simple, where you're mostly working on just the search campaign. You're typically not worried about display or discovery or shopping or video or whatnot. Most local businesses want a very simple search campaign that's just, if you're a family lawyer, we want keywords, around divorce, around child custody, around family lawyer, around these things, so on and so forth. So there's only 3 things that really determine if it's going to work. One, is the business able to do what they need to do? Are they able to close leads at a good rate? Are they able to retain customers long enough? Are they able to, price themselves competitively, so on and so forth? Because at the end of the day, if the customer is worth way less to them than their competitors, then it's going to be a lot more difficult for them to get results. The next thing is just the website.
By the way, that's why I hate paper lead clients, because paper leads, like you generate the leads for them, they don't answer the phone. You're like, what am I spending money on? What am I doing as work for when you don't bother responding?
Yeah, I've done that twice since the last time we spoke, and neither of them worked out properly. Every single time it was, hey, why are 60% of your calls going unanswered?
Yeah, it's the same issue, so I got out of it.
Yeah, exactly. And then the website has to be working, or the landing page has to be working, and then just what's in the account, which is how much you pay is dependent on what your competitors are paying. So if your competitors are paying, $20 a click profitably, then you should be able to pay $20 a click profitably if your website is converting about the same, if your business is doing about the same. And those are just really the factors that determine into it. If your business does a lot better, you can actually afford to pay more per click and get the same result. If your business doesn't do as good, they need to pay less per click to get the same result. And that's where it can be a bit of a thing, if you will, on local. And then just from there, it's just a matter of time of bringing it down. We worked with a family lawyer, started off with $120 cost per acquisition, or cost per lead, and then within 5 months it was down to about $80, I believe, and then 7 months in it was down to like $50 or so. So it's just a matter of like just working it down over time.
Yeah.
But yeah, e-commerce is, and SaaS as well, and just businesses that don't kind of fall in with like the typical local, is where there's a lot more questions, because in some e-commerce industries, it's just price you to the bottom, where they're a clothing retailer and they're competing against Walmart and Kohl's and Amazon and all these places that mass manufacture, that it costs them like 20 cents a t-shirt, and these guys, it costs them $2 a t-shirt. And so that's where it can be really hard, because you can't beat them on price. You have to beat them on conversion. You have to beat them on retention. You have to beat them on, maybe your products are high enough price that you're going to be able to make it up on the back end with, how high it costs you to actually obtain a customer in the first place. And unproven products as well. This is something that that there are, especially when you are in smaller markets, is that if they haven't advertised beforehand, they have to prove that their business model that they're offering is actually interesting to customers who are coming to them through search, display, shopping, whatever it may be. And that can be another thing where, hey, you're first to market, or you're one of the few people that actually offer this. Nobody knows that this exists, and so we can't just target people who are searching for this, because no one's searching for it. We have to find people who would be interested in this. Kind of similar to Facebook at that point, where you're not targeting searcher, you're targeting based on audiences. And that's where it can be a lot more complicated, where it can take a lot more time, and where we're jumping into a lot more engagements, where we're like, you just have at first we don't know we're going to be working together, 6, 12 months from now. We're going to spend the next 3 months figuring out if you're even viable as an advertiser on this platform.
Sure. And what about from your perspective? So that's the client perspective. I agree with all that. What about from your perspective? How is it better or different from doing SEO?
Sure. So one of the benefits is that the profit margins are actually higher if you can price yourself properly. And this is something that most people who do SEO are always very,
Yeah,
very surprised
I'm
on.
already sorry. How
And
does that work?
so, and so, well, ultimately it comes down to a couple things. One is how well do you actually understand the Google Ads platform? If you have no idea what you're doing, then it's going to take you more time to work on it, of course.
Sure. Yeah.
Next is how are you operating on the SEO side of things? And the reason why I say that is that there are some people that that we both know that will sell something for $2,000-$3,000 a month and then go pay somebody $299 a month to do the work. Like at the end of the
Unfortunately,
day,
yeah.
like that's like your margins on that are always going to be better because there's no realistic way that you're going to find that on paid. But for those who have realistic operating margins on SEO and on PPC, at a certain scale, it can be much more profitable. However, not so much on the smaller advertisers. The people who are just spending like a grand or two a month on their ads, your margins are pretty tight. That's where we find that we're really only taking on customers at that rate if we feel as though we can scale their budget, because we don't make a whole lot of money on that. We charge them like a couple $100 and we maybe have like $150 in expenses for that in the first place. So we're really only working with them to hopefully get them to increase their budget over time. But when we're working with advertisers who have 5, 10, 15, $20,000 a month, the expectation of what they're paying for management is that it's going to be, it's going to be $1,000, $2,000, maybe even $3,000 a month for management, and you're able to have much higher margins on there. Where I can't speak for myself, but I do know another PPC agency that I follow very well that they have about 80% margins, 80% operating margin, that is, on their own PPC stuff. Now,
It
granted,
makes
they
sense.
use
It's just a
data.
management fee, right?
Exactly. So it's just a matter
Yeah.
of time. There's very little tools that you actually need, with the exception of shopping. Just because shopping, you have like a shopping feed that's an XML file that pulls in, and that's a pain to manage. And usually you'll use third party software for that. But in terms of like search and display and whatnot, like we can manage advertisers who are spending tens of thousands of dollars a month with just one person doing the work, maybe like a designer if we need like ad copy, if we need ad visuals or whatnot. But we can have one person just spending a couple hours a week managing a campaign that pulls in a decent amount of money, and we don't need any tools or software necessarily to do any of that. Any tools and software we've tried just hasn't been worth it. So we don't really need tools. We don't really need software necessarily. We only really need one person to work on stuff, assuming that they know what they're doing and that we're able to, they only have so much time in the day. So eventually you'll need more people at scale, but we're able to just go, okay, great. Here's the account. Here's how much time to spend on it. Go ahead and do that. And over time, when the account is working, the amount of time that we have to put into that is quite a bit less. The way that I like to explain it is that at first we're just collecting data. We're trying to figure out how can we get this account to work? What is the most profitable market that we can work this account in? And then over time, the account is stable. Like we have a client that it's very, very predictable. We know that on average, they get about the same amount of leads. It costs about the same amount. Every once in a while, we'll get like a breakthrough where a click-through rate goes up a little bit, or a conversion rate goes up a little bit, or cost per click goes down a little bit. But we're not seeing like 200, 300% gains like we might
Sure.
see over the
Yeah.
course
Yeah.
of like the first 6 months or so with an account, where there's a lot more that we're testing. And so for them, honestly, if we didn't need to, we honestly wouldn't have to touch that account for probably months at a time, and it would still be working. Now we still go into that account, of course, that we can improve what we're going on to get as much as possible. But that account is pretty much in the quote unquote printing money phase, where where they're just it's working. It's very, very reliable. The best choice for that advertiser at this point is to scale their budget, which will increase the amount of work that we have to do, and then we'll have
And this is
more
because
data
of
to work
search
with.
ads, right? Because if you do
Correct.
like Facebook ads or display ads, they die out relatively quickly.
Correct. So when you get off of the search ads, that's a little bit different. But most advertisers, at least the ones that we work with right now, are very heavily on the search. When it comes to
Yeah, makes
display,
sense. Yeah.
you do have the creative ads, and you do have to change them out, but not as much as Facebook, which I haven't dived into. But talking to Facebook
Okay.
advertisers, like some people, it seems like after a couple of weeks or like a month or whatever, you have to change out the ad because it's
Yeah,
dead.
exactly. Yeah.
Whereas with display, just not as much, really, to be honest.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. But with search, yeah, I haven't done that much with search ads. Not in years anyway. I used to do it, but it was once the campaign was kind of set up, we didn't really have to do that much. Granted, I was very bad at it, and you're probably much better. But either way, once you've optimized it properly, I agree. It's kind of keeping it, which again a little bit different to SEO there as well. But with SEO, one thing that I kind of liked, and I'm curious on your opinion on this, is with SEO, I find it's quite easy to outsource quite a lot. You can go to a link vendor and buy some links. You can, there's a bazillion on-page freelancers that you can hire and whatnot. With ads, and I'm thinking more on the Facebook ads perspective again, because I know people had difficulties with this that are friends of mine. They have a media buyer or they don't have a media buyer. And graphic design, sure, that stuff's easy. Do you find it's difficult to manage it that way? Because if I presume even for search ads, you need someone that understands it, or is there a very systematic approach to running the ads to set them up?
Sure. So in comparison specifically on hiring, is that when we were looking for a PPC specialist, it was something that it was more difficult to find somebody reliable because we know that we're going to have to pay somebody quite a bit for somebody that's doing
Yeah,
well on the ads front. Like you're not going to find that dude in India who charges you $3 an hour that really underprices himself and actually knows what he's doing to a certain extent because he doesn't know how to price himself. Like you're just very unlikely to find that in the ad space, where you'll find that guy in India who's charging $50 an hour to manage the ads. You'll find that person in the US that wants 35, 50 an hour as a minimum. And so we knew going in
still
that it
quite
was going
reasonable
to
to be
be
fair.
we knew that it was going to be someone that was going to be more pricely. And so because of that, we didn't get, or costly rather, so we didn't get like this massive pool of people. We put out an ad out there, like every job platform I could think of. And we looked at about 7, 8 different people. Anyone wanted between 25 and like $60 an hour. We basically told everyone, hey, here's an account, audit it. Let's see what's kind of going on there. And then it was just a matter of figuring out like who uh, who had a understanding of the things that we wanted them to have an understanding for. When it comes to SEO, it is a lot easier to find somebody in the respect of I can find a million people that do link building. I can find a million people that write content, that do on-site, that do whatever it may be. Now, the challenge that I have on the SEO front is that it's very hard to find somebody who does it well. That's what
Yep,
I run into a lot of issue
true.
with, is the quality of the work. And this is something that we still run into quite a bit on the SEO front, which is that for a long time, I was looking for somebody who's reliable on the on-page front, because that's one of the areas that I still have to dive way too much into is on-page. And I've worked with, I can't even count how many people that I have worked with that, that charge well, that seem like they really know what they're doing, and you give them a site, they work on it, and you're like, why haven't you done any internal linking? Why isn't there any? And they're like, oh, I didn't know that that's something that you wanted me to do. And so I found that SEO tends to be much harder to hire reliably for. I run into a lot more issues where people come in and they do good work and then they disappear, or they sometimes do good work and sometimes they don't do good work, and it's
Do you
a
think
lot
this
more.
is a difference in with SEO? There's no like, here's a document of every single fact you need to know. Here's every single thing you need to learn. Versus with PPC, it's a lot more instructional to create ads and
Hmm.
manage ads.
I think that's certainly an aspect of it. I think one of the other things is that with SEO, specifically with client-facing SEO, is that there are a lot of people who get into this space who have sometimes been in this space for years and still don't know what they're doing, because the people who have hired them also don't know what they're doing. I mean, most of my
True.
clients
Yeah.
don't know like SEO. They're like, I've heard of the term backlinks, but like they're just like, hey, do this thing. And so it's a lot easier to work with somebody over a long period of time, getting minimal results, and then somebody being happy about that, or like just not understanding like the education of the end client tends to be pretty low still on the SEO side of things, and it makes sense. It's fairly technical, it's fairly complex, and it's always changing. What's different on the ads front is that you will run into many more clients who are comfortable in understanding what the dashboard means and know whether or not things are working and how well that they're working, because it's a lot easier for them to understand it as well. So in that respect, I think it's a lot harder to go into PPC without knowing what you're doing versus with SEO, where I think it's pretty easy with SEO to have no idea what you're doing and then jump into, a client and kind of figure it out, or, some people just don't figure it out and just want to screw people over all day and make money. But compared to the PPC side of things, where you're much more likely to run into people who will look at like, what is the ad copy that's being used? Because they know what ad copy would make sense or would talk about their business or not. And so they'll know like, hey, why does that say that, or whatever it may be? Because a lot of times they've tried running their own ads before because it looks like a platform that they would know, because they get calls from Google, and then Google's like, hey, set up some ads, we'll walk you through it. And so there's a lot more familiarity with the platform on the PPC side of things than on the SEO side of things from clients. And because of that, I do feel as though that those who make it in any sort of longevity are basically forced to actually know what they're doing to a certain extent. Otherwise, they just wouldn't be able to retain people.
That makes sense. If someone is listening now, and obviously had the fact that you said years learning before you dive into this, you actually spent a lot of time studying, you didn't just suddenly go out there and just start taking on clients. But for anyone that's listening that wants to learn, is there kind of like an 80-20 of principles or strategies or techniques they should focus on learning first?
Yeah, sure. So I would definitely say don't dive into it like I do. The thing with me is I have pretty bad ADHD, and so when I get into something, I get into it. I'm like I always say that I'm like a sponge that's discovered cocaine. I just absorb knowledge like in the most insane way possible, and that's just my personality. And I just don't really dive into things until I feel very confident in them. But that doesn't mean that anybody has to do nearly as much work. So a couple things that I would say for sure is you can there contrasting to SEO, the information you get from Google is actually very helpful for PPC. Their documentation on how the system works is helpful. Their incentive is to get you to spend more money on the platform, which means that they want your ads to be working. So they have a pretty good interest in making sure that it's working. So the number one thing that I say for everybody needs to figure out is how to track conversions, because your conversion tracking will tell you whether or not the ads are actually working. I can't tell you how many times I get into accounts and there is no conversion tracking. For e-commerce, they're not tracking sales, which is literally like 2 button clicks. For local, they're sometimes tracking forums. Very rarely are they tracking phone calls. But you need to be tracking their conversions, because then you can see exactly how well the ads are actually working. I can't tell you how many times I talk to people, whether they're marketers or whether they're advertisers, that are like, I feel that the ads are working because I turned them on, I got some clicks, and I got some calls. And then we actually set up conversion tracking, and they're not actually getting anything from it. So conversion track is the number one thing, because it's going to tell you how well of a job you're doing. It's going to tell you,
I guess with that as well, I don't know how much, it depends on the budget of the client, I guess, but there's an element of testing there, and you got to figure out which ads perform best and everything. And if you're not tracking anything, then you can't test, or you can, but you're not really going to find out the answer.
Exactly. That's a big mistake that I see people making, is that everything within the ad account is a test. Whether you're running multiple ads, you're running on multiple days, you're testing what days work best, you're testing what hours work best, you're testing audiences. If you add your audiences in there, you're testing different devices and so on and so forth, demographics, psychographics, etc. And so if you don't have conversion tracking set up, any adjustments that you make to your bids are going to be based on unreliable data. And so, for example, somebody might go, hey, our click-through rate on mobile is 8%, or it's only 5% on desktop. So let me add a positive bid adjustment. I mean, I'm willing to spend more money on mobile, or maybe I'll add a negative bid adjustment to desktop. but it's only based on click-through rate. You might find that desktop has a 5% click-through rate, but a 20% conversion rate, or mobile has an 8% click-through rate, but a 4% conversion rate, or whatever it may be. So conversions are the most important thing. Everything you optimize has to be based around conversions, which is very different from the SEO side of things where you're testing, which is that you want to test something. There's a million different factors that you have to consider, especially if you're running any tests on a live website, because there are changes happening to the website all the time. There were links that were built months ago. You have to factor in, what's this change happening, or this new blog post that got posted, whatever it may be. Where on page, it's isolated a lot more, so it's easier to run tests. And that's the second thing, is that the advertiser has to have the budget for that. And I wouldn't recommend jumping in with a client if they have an incredibly small budget in respect to their cost per click, which is, if we're working with, let's say, personal injury, if in some markets we're looking at $80 to $150 per click. If they're working with $1,000 a month ad budget, that's a handful of clicks. That's like 10 clicks a month. Or maybe if you get lucky, 15, 20, but that's not a whole lot of data. It's going to take you forever to run a single test. And so what happens is, if your conversion rate on your landing page is really low, it might take you 6 to 8 months to have enough clicks to run a simple A/B test, one test, to figure out what's working better. And so what's happening is you actually have a much higher chance of failure with smaller advertisers than with larger advertisers, because of that. Same client maybe had, let's say, a $8,000 ad spend budget, which for advertising, that's not a large amount of money for a business to spend on their marketing whatsoever. Large amount if they were spending all that in SEO, but in terms of ads, not really. Now, if that same advertiser, $8,000 a month, let's say, $100 a click, that's 80 clicks a month. Still not a ton of clicks, to be honest, but you're going to be able to make judgments much faster. In fact, comparatively to the 1,000, 8 times faster than what you'd be able to do with a smaller budget. You're going to be able to figure out much faster what ad gets a higher click-through rate, what days of the week convert more often, what devices work best, what landing page variation converts more. And so you're going to be able to figure out not only how to improve things, but if things aren't working, you're going to be able to figure out how they can work a lot faster. And that can be a pitfall where we're working with very little data and something's not working, and we just don't have the time to figure out what's working. Because even though it's not costing that business a whole lot more money, they also look at the time aspect. You could look at a big business and go, $1,000 a month, they don't care. If it takes us 4 months to figure this out, it takes us 4 months. It's only $1,000. They're not going to notice that missing. But what they do notice is that it's been 4 months. They're like, why isn't this working? It's been 4 months. Even though they don't have the data.
Yeah.
So that's something that we've had to learn over time, which is that we'd be like, oh man, there are so many businesses that we can work with that are so much smaller on the SEO front that we would never work with on SEO, because they're just too small of a business. They can't afford the SEO. They don't have the business acumen for it, but they can drop, $500, $800 a month on ads. And then we can just charge them like $100 or $200 to manage it. It's not going to take any of my time, and we're going to be profitable on it. We'll scale that over time. And even if only 1 of 10 of those people end up scaling their budget, it'll be worth it in the long run for us. And we'll have then we'll be able to work with them bigger and bigger stuff over time. Great. But the issue is had really big issues with retention for anybody that was really spending under about $2,000 a month. Depending on the cost per click, it could be even higher, just because the amount of time it takes if something goes wrong to figure something out is just too much. Like, hey, our cost per lead is $65. We want that to get to $50. Well, to run the test to figure out, exactly what's going to impact that the most, I might need 2-3 months for that person, and they might not have the acumen to actually sit down and be able to go, okay, great, I'm going to wait 2-3 months. Whereas 3 weeks later, they're then like, hey, why isn't this, where it needs to be?
Yeah, I think SEOs can relate to that. Yeah, that makes sense to me. That's interesting. So a question a lot of people are going to ask, and you kind of mentioned it offhandedly when you said that $8,000 a month isn't that much for ads, but is a lot for SEO. Because my question is, obviously, I agree, $8,000 a month client would be decent for SEO. It would be pretty good. But for ads is not that much. So what types of clients is it you're working with if they're going to be spending 10, 15 grand, $8,000 a month, something like that?
Yeah, sure. So I tend to find that beyond the $5,000 a month mark in terms of ad spend, they either have very good business acumen or they're not local. The reason being is that with a lot of local businesses, their thought process is never on ROI. Like, this is something that I've learned over time, is don't try to sell a local business on ROI. They just don't get it. They don't care. They only care about spend. They only care about what it costs them. Trying to convince somebody that worries about, where every dollar of their business is going, about how much money they're going to make, months from now, it just never works. So what I find is that uh, businesses who actually understand the scalability of things, and that, hey, if I'm spending 3 and I'm making 6, or I'm spending 3 and I'm making 9. If I spend 5, I'll make 15, or whatever it may be. They'll scale their budgets pretty quickly as to however much volume they can take on. With local businesses, it's really just a matter of how much they can take on, which is highly dependent on how many people they have on their team. So you'll hit a brick wall at some point with service-based businesses, because they can only take on so much work until they hire more people, and they might not always want to hire more people for that scalability. So with the businesses who are spending more money, a lot of them do tend to be on the SaaS or the e-commerce side, because it's a lot more scalable with their budgets. And they are something that's very interesting is if you look at advertisers who are on the SaaS and e-commerce front, they often talk about their results based on how much money they're spending on the accounts, not how much money they're making, which is very interesting. So they'll often say, here's how I scaled the ad spend of this client from $1,000 a month to $1,000 a day. Like, that's very interesting that they're not talking about the results. And as far as I can tell, the reason why they're talking about it that way is because the profitability is implied, that you would only increase your ad budget if it was profitable in the first place. And a lot of these businesses don't expect the ROI numbers that a lot of smaller businesses want. Where if you talk to a smaller business, for every dollar they spend, they want to make $10 back. When you talk to a more established business, for every dollar they spend, they want to make $2 back.
Which is
And so
great. Yeah.
and so they understand that, hey, if I spend 10 and I make 20, that's an extra 10 grand a month. Like, I could hire somebody off of that, right? Like, so even if it's only doubling, like, the value there is pretty understood. So the businesses who are spending more, they just understand business better, to be honest. And that's something that we're trying to get better at identifying when we're talking with prospective clients, is how well do they actually understand business, not just necessarily their industry or the marketing channel that we're going after. Are we going to be able to approach this person when they're spending $3,000 a month on ads and get them to spend $5,000 a month on ads? Because there are some people that just go, nope, I'm spending 3, I'm making money for it, now I'm going to go spend my money on this other channel or this other channel or this other channel.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that was the best explanation there, but in terms of
No,
spend,
I get that.
mostly business acumen.
And I think that's huge for anything. The same thing applies with SEO, and obviously you're still selling SEO, so you know this as well.
Right.
If you speak to a business owner, this is why I'm doing e-commerce stuff now, is because when you speak to someone that owns an e-com business and they're making whatever, $1 million a year, then they understand business and they have you have a proper business mindset, and they're thinking about this from an ROI perspective. Because I agree with you. I don't think you can teach them business. I don't think you can teach them to think from an ROI perspective. They just think that way or they don't. And the goal, as you mentioned, is to kind of identify that fast so you can choose to work with them or not, rather than trying to train them the right way to think. It's not going to happen.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And it kind of just comes down to how people start these businesses ultimately. Like, if you like, I'm sure most people who are listening to this have read the E-Myth. Like, I think it's kind of like the Bible of the industry, if you will.
Yeah.
Now, if you notice the way that Michael E. Gerber explains how a lot of people start their businesses, and he's very focused on service businesses within that book, is they know the trade and then they decide to start their own business. That's how I got started. That's probably how most people in our industry got started. That's how a lot of people that start service businesses get started. Most people that start roofing companies do it because they were a roofer, or like their dad was, and they start to work for their business and they started their own business or whatever it may be. Most people who were, lawyers didn't start a law firm so they could be a business owner. They started so they could practice law under their own terms, so they didn't have to, were they able to scale things more? They could make more decisions. When people started their own accountancy practice, they didn't do so that they could be a business owner. They did so that they could be an accountant. And so what happens is, the reason why you're forming these businesses is not because you're necessarily thinking about business, is because you're thinking about the work that you're doing. This is how I got started as well. When I started my agency, I wasn't thinking about, here's how I'm going to be in business. I was thinking about, here's how I can do SEO on my own terms. Here's how I can work with my own, choose what clients I work with, choose how I work with these clients, so on and so forth. Whereas with e-commerce and SaaS, it tends to be a bit different, where you do run into a lot more people that were born in from the business side of things and never involved in the fulfillment, right? Some people for sure. I mean, Jeff Bezos started, on the fulfillment side of things with Amazon, right? Like you can certainly, you're not required to never be at that phase, but a lot, like when I work with SaaS businesses, the people who I'm working with, they didn't code the platform. Like they may have had the idea for the platform, but they hired developers right away. They had to understand like how to manage cash flow right away. They had to kind of figure this out. Whereas for other businesses, it tends to be more of a necessity, where they had to hire because they just had too much work and they just had to figure it out. So there's a disconnect sometimes with what percentage of service-based business owners will become business thinkers rather than just kind of like doers, versus on the e-commerce and SaaS front, which I think it's a lot more natural to kind of take that path. And so the challenge on our side of things is to identify those people as best as possible, because the way that they think about business at their own numbers is very different. There's a big difference in a company that wants to pay us $3,000 a month because they're a big enough company that they can just be like, okay, here's $3,000 a month, get me something from that, versus a company who pays us $3,000 a month and has a CRM set up that can track from clicks to cash, and it has goals around hiring, and is able to talk about investments and ROI, and doesn't really involve themselves nearly as much or want to involve themselves in the actual day-to-day operations of the business. There's a big difference in the thinking. To kind of for anyone that maybe doesn't understand, let me bring it back to SEO for a second. There's a big difference in somebody who owns an SEO agency that is doing so just thinking about how can I get more SEO clients, how can I do SEO better, faster, whatever it may be, versus those who are doing it where they're thinking about how can I hire the right person to do this, how can I increase our profitability, how can I track our retention rate better, how can I what markets do we need to enter, or maybe leave, or what are the biggest reasons why people why we lose out clients, how can we set up the systems and processes for that. Not the greatest explanation in the world, I'm sure, but there is a kind of a disconnect between the percentage of people who will kind of think primarily business wise rather than fulfillment wise within service-based businesses versus e-commerce and SaaS, just because of how those businesses get started, in my opinion.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I'd like to know your opinion on this. So for me, I found it's weirdly, maybe not that weird, but it's weird from a perspective of trying to build a business for us. A weird perspective that it tends to be actually easier to sell someone on, or for me, SEO, like a $3,000 a month or $5,000 a month SEO plan for an e-com brand versus a $1,000 a month SEO plan for a local business, because of those things you mentioned, and because they have more cash and among other factors. But I find it way easier to communicate with them, explain the value and the ROI to them, and sign them as a client. Not to mention before that, just like cold outreach or something, getting their attention. I find it easier again for e-commerce than it is for local businesses where they're spammed to death every day with all these offers.
Right, for sure. Yes, when it comes to local, you're way more likely to run into people who are being bombarded by a ton of different people who have maybe worked with a bunch of different people beforehand, mainly because it just the perception is that it's much easier to get in contact with these people. Take any sort of how to grow your agency course or anything like that. Almost all of them, when they talk about customer acquisition, focus on local. Because at the end
Yeah,
of the
mine
day,
too, to be fair.
yeah, I mean, it is easier. You get on these websites, they have a phone number, they have a contact form. A lot of them, the contact form goes right to the owner, or it gets forwarded to them, or they're still answering the phone call. Whereas e-commerce, the number is a 800 customer support number that may or may not even be an in-house customer support. The form fill most likely goes to somebody on the fulfillment or warehouse team, or if they're big enough, actually someone that's dedicated to customer support. the live chat goes to that person as well, where you're not just going to be able to scrape a bunch of websites and mass email blast, e-commerce or SaaS business owners the same way that you would be able to do with local. And so anytime within our space, because there's almost no barrier to entry, when anything seems easy, 99% of people will gravitate towards that, which makes it so the more difficult path that isn't necessarily super difficult has a lot less competition. So something that
Yeah,
I
I've
say,
noticed the same. Yeah.
yeah, for sure. So something that I say, and then you'll have to remind me what your original question was, because honestly, I forgot at this point. But is that something that I say is that when we pitch people, they're only considering two pitches, us and everybody else. The reason being is that everybody else's pitch I know looks the same. I know that they're talking about the same stuff. I know that their pricing is probably around the same. I know that our pricing is almost definitively higher than most other pitches that they're getting, but I also know that ours is coming off of a way different viewpoint. So, for example, we just went through a pitch process with a client, and I was talking about how they need to track their own lifetime value based off of a different model than what they were tracking right now. And I basically walked them through a bunch of different equations for how we can actually determine the success of the campaign and how they should look at things in-house for not just this marketing campaign and other marketing campaigns, so that they could better understand their numbers, and that once everybody understands their numbers, it's going to be a lot easier to scale their budgets based off of the progress that they're actually making. I know for sure that nobody else is talking to them about that, and I know that if they choose us, that's why they're going to be choosing us, because we knew how to talk to them about their business, where everybody else just knows how to talk to them about their marketing channel. But that's just a whole other thing where um, it's going back, working with e-commerce versus local in terms of budgets and whatnot. It does come back to that overall business acumen, which is that are they used to spending money? That's a big thing. Where they're with local or service-based businesses, a lot of them are spending money out of reluctant necessity, where it's I have to
Yeah, that
have
is so
somebody else
true.
answer the phone.
Yeah.
I have to hire somebody to do this. I have to have a CRM because I can't remember all this anymore, or whatever it may be. And those types of people are very cost focused, where it's, do I have to pay this person $2,000 a month for SEO, or can I pay this other person that says it's going to be $500 a month for SEO? Because they're not necessarily, they're very cost oriented. And so working with those businesses uh, can be a good niche, because what you do find is that it's overall a little bit more simple. You can make any change you want to their website. They don't care. You can add any content. You could hire that 2 cents a word writer that writes poor content and slap it on their website, because we all know it's going to rank, even though it reads like crap, because they don't care. Whereas if you're working with someone that understands the business side of things, I was talking to a local business yesterday. They have a real brand. They're very concerned about how their brand messaging is. They're concerned about, their overall messaging, how things are worded, what's on their website, what's not on their website. They're concerned about how the quality of the SEO work will affect their brand recognition, where they're like, hey, I want to make sure that who I'm working with isn't going to spam the crap out of people, or like write bad content, because I don't want people coming to the website believing that that's what my brand believes in. So that's a lot more difficult of a client to work with, because you have to keep that in mind. You have to be able to, if you're doing content, you have to be able to write content at a level that they're going to like. Also, with other more sophisticated clients, they might have their own uh, more sophisticated call tracking or funnels within their website, and so they're expecting somebody that has that knowledge and can talk to them about that in that way. Whereas if you don't understand how some of the systems that they have set up work, where they have they have a form system that, based on keywords that people input in a form, it automatically goes to them or automatically doesn't go to them, so that it cleans up their inbox for their front desk person. Well, if you don't know how that works, or you don't understand that system, you could very easily break that, where you put up a form somewhere else that doesn't have that built in because you just didn't know, or whatever it may be. Or when they have more knowledge about what you're doing, or they seem more knowledgeable than you do, then that can be a bit of an issue. So there are like pros and cons to working with more sophisticated
Yeah.
businesses versus less sophisticated businesses. And there's going to be a different niche for everybody. So I'm not trying to say like, hey, nobody should work with these types of people. It's going to be, if you're just starting off, I think working with the more simplistic views on
Yeah.
kind of marketing make a lot more sense, because you don't have to worry about a lot of the extra things where we have to worry about how is the marketing person going to interpret this when they talk to the CEO about what we're asking them to do or whatever it may be.
Yeah, there's trade-offs of both ultimately. You just got to pick. Generally speaking, if you're unhappy with the smaller clients and you've got years of experience, I think there is quite a bigger opportunity if you do make that shift into your e-commerce, your SaaS, and generally bigger companies.
Right, for sure. We've noticed that over time, as our own kind of business acumen has grown, we've needed to work with other businesses that have that acumen. The reason being
Yes,
is that
exactly.
it's very hard to, at least in my mind, it's very hard and frustrating to understand how much tracking you can have set up where we could have conversations about exactly how much money is in your bank because of this marketing channel, and how much is your, what percentage of people do you close, and what's your uh, uh, estimated lead value and all these stuff, because you have those numbers, versus somebody who's maybe been in business for a while, but they don't have a CRM. They don't they're when you say, hey, I mean, I run into this sometimes too, which is a big warning sign when somebody's like, hey, I'm more than willing to spend thousands of dollars, whether that's through ad spend and our ad management fee or whether that's through SEO. But when we're like, okay, great, please sign up for call rail. It's $45 a month. It used to be 30, but now it's 45. So we can track what we're doing. We can track if we're doing a good job or not and report that to you. And they're like, I don't know. $45 seems like a whole lot. Like that's just like, that's where we have to walk away from that, because we know that we're not going to be able to report on things how we want to, and talk to that client like we want to. And so it's just a matter of, where you kind of position yourselves. And over time, we've just had to position ourselves with higher business understanding uh, clients, just so that we can have those conversations as easily as possible. And when they don't have that set up, we can have a conversation about helping them set up some of that stuff. So when they say, we don't use a CRM because we use this other like platform that tracks things, but it's not really supposed to be a CRM. It's like a appointment management tool or whatever. And we're like, okay, great. Here's the benefit of a CRM. Like we won't set it up for you, but we can help you, figure out what features you need, and like, how do these APIs work together and whatnot, so that you can track that. There's a big difference in people who go, that's awesome. That sounds really cool. If I can look at my account and go, here's all my leads, here's exactly where they all came from, versus somebody who just wants to base things off of feelings, which is like, hey, I feel as though things are working really well because I set this up and then I started getting more phone calls, but in reality, they're not.
Last question on the PPC stuff. What was that question? I was literally just, oh, so you said most of your clients now are on the PPC side.
Mm-hmm.
What is the management side of things like compared to, not necessarily the fulfillment, the client relationship, client management side of things with PPC versus SEO?
Yeah, sure. So there's a lot more communication back and forth. The reason being is that clients feel much more confident looking at their account, especially bigger businesses. When you're working with larger, more established businesses that have in-house marketing people, they typically have experience operating profitable PPC campaigns. It's just that they don't have the time or the resources or the knowledge to necessarily do it at a higher level. Whereas on the SEO front, I mean, some of my clients I hear from once a month. Sometimes I hear from every couple months, because it's a lot more hands off. So you will run into a lot more conversations about that. Some depending on the business, especially depending on the ad spend, they'll want more so kind of weekly updates on how things have happened, because there is stuff going on week by week, on a day by day basis, where how many leads did we get this week? If they're spending enough money, the reporting basically goes from monthly to weekly. So there's a lot more conversation back and forth where the client is a lot more educated at basically any level because they can understand the dashboard a lot more, where oftentimes they were running their own ads beforehand or they hire somebody beforehand and they have some amount of understanding. So you have to have um, a good understanding of what you're doing compared to SEO. I think PPC is a lot harder to get into with no knowledge and just wing it, because you're going to be in an instance where there's a good chance the client knows more than you do, and that never looks good unless they know that you're charging only a little bit a month and hourly or whatever it may be. So there's a lot more communication. Um, there's there's also a lot more communication of us pushing things to the client in terms of, hey, here's a question that we had, or here's yeah, excuse me, I'm still recovering from the
I can
non-corona
see.
flu. So
You have to
there's a lot more.
specify that.
Oh yeah, no, we got tested and everything came back negative, luckily. But there's a lot more of, hey, I think you should increase your budget, or we want to put this in your ad copy, but we're not really sure, if this is accurate necessarily. Just a lot more conversations back and forth. To be honest, I think that's the biggest differentiator. To be honest, is that there's a lot more touch points and there's a lot more expectation.
It makes sense. It's a lot more active.
Right.
Yeah, sure, for lack of a better word. um, here's something a complete different topic. So one thing I struggle with a lot before, still kind of done it sometimes, is like the shiny object syndrome type thing. It's I don't know if it's because we're both pretty young. You're obviously younger than I am, or other things, but that idea, like, I don't really know what I want to do sometimes, and kind of jump in between things and trying to figure out what exactly it is you want to do. Now, I know you had the same thing because you went from the UpWork stuff to the agency and then shifting kind of to PPC and stuff. I don't particularly have a question on it, but I'm just interested in kind of your thoughts on it and how someone should overcome this, if that's really the thing they should be thinking about, or what.
Yeah. So it's certainly interesting, especially because with the living with the ADHD, what happens a lot is I'll suddenly get into something and then I'll spend a lot of time diving into it. So for example, something that I'm really interested right now is robotics. And so I dive into a lot of that, and sometimes I'll be like, I need to work on this deliverable, and then I have this other screen up that's like teaching me how to work with like Arduinos and like woodworking and all that kind of stuff, to like, here's how you like build a robot, stuff that I can't even do because I don't have the equipment for hand. But I just like dive really into that. Or I'll be looking at I'm really interested in branding right now, because that's something that we're going through. Is we're rebranding an agency, and so while working with this other branding company, I'm like, this is some really cool stuff that they're doing. Should this be something that we eventually offer? What does it look like to be a branding company? I think that's really cool. It'd be so cool if we could offer that to a client or whatever it may be, and kind of diving into that. So I think it's something that being on the internet is, it's just something you're going to either have the personality that has it or that doesn't. Like I know some people that are very, very focused, that they just focus on one thing. They couldn't care less about anything else that's going around, and other people that are really interested in a bunch of different things. I think it's something that, for me personally, it was just something that I had to fail at enough before I started focusing a lot more, where I had to, even within like just focusing on the agency, I had to fail at trying to do way too much, where I was trying to dedicate time every day to getting client work done, to trying to write content or film videos, trying to um, uh, work on the business and improve it, trying to keep up with clients, trying to get new clients all at the same time, or even do all that within a single week, where it's just nothing was making enough progress. So it's just over time seeing everything kind of seeing enough stuff fall through the cracks, where I just had to go, okay, well, something has to be cut. And so you'll notice that I don't produce a whole lot of content nowadays. The reason being is that I need to focus on other things first until I free myself up enough that I can actually work on that without having to worry about it. We're in a pretty good place in terms of the number of clients that we have, so we don't really put any effort into acquisition, where we mostly rely on referrals and stuff that's already coming in through inbound from the channels and content that has been
Awesome.
produced beforehand.
Yeah.
And so we can worry about that later on. So for me, it was just a matter of
Prioritization, right? I had a chat with Michal Suski, if I can say his name remotely correct, from Surfer today. We just recorded that. And we started talking about prioritization in terms of SEO when it comes to which pages to focus on first. But then we got into talking about all the features they're working on, which is super cool. I'm not sure if you're following along with it. It got me going now. And he was, again, when it comes to features, again, they have to prioritize, okay, which feature to release first, which is the more important thing to work on. And it's the same thing with you, and I have the same thing as well. When you get caught up and you get into something and you start looking at some other things to work on, it's deciding what should I prioritize. And for you, like, content wasn't that priority, so you had to drop it temporarily.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that that I've just had to learn over time, because I struggled with it a lot more a couple years ago, which was where I still wasn't and I still ask myself these questions sometimes, where I just didn't know, do I want to like pursue having like a really big team? Do I want to pursue having like a really small team? Do I want to pursue being virtual or in-house or different services, or only one service, or whatever it may be? And
did you figure it out, or did you just decide?
I think what happened was, as we continued to operate and as I continued to look into other businesses, I started to get a better understanding of what I like and what makes sense based off of my interests and beliefs, if you will, versus what doesn't. So something that I was conflicted at the last time during the last interview was, did we want to build out a more boutique style agency, one where we have a limited team, we work with a smaller client base, we demand fairly high rates, but everybody who's working on there are mid to senior level people who are able to execute work at a very high level and demand fairly high rates because of it, and work with bigger businesses in that sense? Versus, did we want to do something where we're more operating like a company like Scorpion almost, which is a $150 million a year agency, where we build out like a sales team, and we have a bunch of people working, and we have everything pretty processized, and we focus on getting people in. The more clients we're working with, the better. And ultimately, what kind of went through my mind was just figure out, like, that's just not what I'm interested in. It's just eventually I just figured that out. And I was like, I much prefer being on the smaller team side of things. I would involve myself with the agencies where I actually like went to some people's offices and I worked there. I was like, okay, great. Here's what it's like working with like a small team versus like a massive team. Let me like ask some questions. And I figured out, like, as cool as it would be in some respect to very quickly remove myself from everything in a more like volume style agency and just say yes to a bunch more people, make a bunch more money, hire people, and just be like, hey, do the work, hope for the best. It just wasn't something that I was personally interested in, where I was much more interested in working with a much smaller client base with a smaller team to work at a higher rate. And once I kind of figured that out, it was a lot easier to have a filter. And that's what's really great about it. That took me a long time to figure it out, but then I have a filter where
you figured it out by doing things.
Exactly.
Not by reading books and like, okay, maybe I like this, maybe I like that, by actually trying things out and doing it.
Right, because at the end of the day, reading books, listening to podcasts, like, everything just sounds cool. Like, it sounds cool to listen to the person that has that $150 million agency, and they're like, I spend all day like doing talks and like filling out reports or whatever. Like, I have people that handle every aspect of the business for me. Like, I could go on vacation for 2 years and like not have to worry about, like, that sounds cool. But also, so does the person that's like, we have a really small niche team that's like 4 people. Our clients are at least $10,000 a month. We work with some, household name brands. We're executing work at a very high level, and we're market leaders and whatnot. I'm like, that sounds really cool too. So it's just a matter of figuring out, like, they both sound good to have, but which one sounds good to build? And so, you're not necessarily going to want to build both, but you might, like, it would be really cool to to have a bunch of like fancy cars. Like I think like some of the fancy cars that are out there are like pretty cool, but I'm not a car person at all. Like I don't actually want to spend money on them. And
Same.
so right, so
I look at the cars like I'd like to have one, but I don't want to spend any money on it because I don't really care that much.
right, exactly. So once you figure that out, which for me it was just a matter of time. Honestly, it took me years to figure it out. But once I figured it out, I had a pretty clear filter where I can now, if I have an idea, I'll be like, oh, that's cool, but that's not for us, right? Like, here's how we could,
Yeah.
like, I have this. I'll eventually release it because I don't use it anymore. But I built this pretty cool semi-automated cold emailing platform, or that works with a couple tools and spreadsheets and whatnot, that allowed us to fairly automate higher end cold emailing to a certain extent, where it massively reduced the time. It's not like press a button and you're good to go, but it did make things a lot easier. And we just wouldn't use something like that nowadays because that's not what we're going after. It would be pointless for us to blast out that much information and then get 5-10 people trying to work with us all at once. We take on maybe at most 1 or 2 accounts a month, and sometimes we'll go, okay, great, we're not taking on anybody for a couple months, until like somebody leaves or until we figure ourselves up or whatever it may be. So having that filter makes things a lot easier. We're able to decide what acquisition channels make sense or don't make sense for us. Like right now, I'm doing a lot of podcasts. I'm getting on a lot of podcasts. The reason being is that I know that these are going to be up for years to come. I don't. It's going to slowly over time bring more people to me. Versus if I were to do something like Facebook ads that leads to like a webinar that leads to like some like email sequence. It's like that
What
could
I
be
also
great.
like about these, by the way, sorry
Yeah.
to interrupt you again, is the podcast is brand.
Right.
So you said it's up forever, but it's also when someone searches Jarod Spiewak, or you said you're rebranding your agency, but when you said your agency name, then they see this content, and I think I don't know exactly, but I'm pretty sure it helps quite a lot when they search and
Mhm.
see all these different podcast interviews and stuff like that. It's very good positioning.
Yes. Yes, there are a couple things I do with podcasts, and you're completely right that it helps unbrand. There have been times where people have, funny enough, if you remember for, honestly, I can't remember the name, but when we were doing like the webinars and stuff together, one of the things that we did that you put public was like my local SEO like webinar that I did for your group. I've gotten leads off of that. Like I've had people like Google like local SEO and be like, hey, like I saw you do that thing, which is kind of cool. But like I've had people reach out to me based on shows that I've done years ago. And I've also hired people or companies that I have heard on podcasts like years beforehand.
Sure, yeah.
And so it helps with that aspect. It helps with branding, and it does help with closing as well. When somebody reaches
Definitely.
out to me and they're like a dentist, I mainly just go, okay, here are the couple podcasts I did with that were specific to dentists. Like, don't talk to me. Like, go listen to these. A law firm reaches out to me. Like, I have plenty of case studies around law firms, but also like, here's a couple like legal specific podcasts I've done where you can go and listen to that and know that I'm not completely an idiot. And just like a linking to that, it helps close quite a bit because people are able to listen
Yeah.
to you. What happens is people feel a lot more familiar with you. People are a lot more willing to buy from somebody that they feel is familiar. This is why a lot of companies invest in ads that do nothing but mention the name. Like Coca-Cola knows that when they put up a Super Bowl ad, nobody's going, "Oh, I could use some Coke right now." No, it's just so that when you're in the aisle and you're looking at Coke and Pepsi, Coke is more familiar of a name than Pepsi. That's what they're doing.
Can I
And
just say
yeah,
that is the point behind the video audits that I've been teaching like forever. It's like people are like, why don't you just get on the phone? It's because when they watch that video first, closing is so much easier because they've watched something, they've familiarized themselves with you, and they trust you because they've watched something that helped them added value.
exactly. And
A lot
so
of people don't
typically,
get that.
if I get on the phone with somebody and they've said they've listened to my stuff or they see my stuff before, I know that they're closed. I just know because I know that nobody else that
Yeah.
they're talking to has that. Very, very seldom do they do. I know that even if they're talking to about 15, 20 other people, maybe one other person has been on a thing or two, but they can see things that I've written. They can see podcasts that I've been on. They can see podcasts that I've done. They can see interviews that I've given. They can see talks that I've given. And I'll get on the phone with people and they're like, oh, I listened to this. And if they're talking to me, that means that they liked whatever they heard me say already. So yeah, they're immensely powerful if you have something interesting to say on them.
Yeah, that's the build up some experience first.
Yeah.
start with the easier clients if you have to get some results, practice a little bit, and then you can get into this stuff. That's why I teach like cold outreach. Cold outreach works well, you know that yourself. And it's easier to start all this stuff, even if it's not necessarily the best approach. I prefer inbound. But when you're starting out, inbound's not necessarily the best thing to do, nor the easiest thing to do.
And what's interesting is that it kind of it does flip flop as you grow, which is that as you're starting off, outbound is best because there's no way you could have anything inbound coming out. Like you have nothing, and then over time, inbound gets better, where now you don't have to put in the work, but at a certain scale, outbound becomes better again. Because what happens is with inbound, you can't control who's coming to you. Like you get what you get. Whereas with outbound, you have all this experience, and you're not at that point. It kind of flip flops where a lot of people start off with very broad approaches to their outbound, and then once you're a lot more experienced, you're reaching out to, maybe you're doing more ABM or account based marketing, where you're reaching out to like 5-10 stores, and you're like, hey, I followed you. I think that you're a really cool company. I know for sure that I can help you. Here's some of the stuff I've done. Let's get on a call together. Because at a certain point, like, you know that you can help somebody. Like at this point, like, we know that whoever we work with, we can help them. We would only take on somebody we know that. So it's just a matter of choosing the right.
That's how you sell better as well, right? I'm not. I don't think people realize I'm really, really bad at sales. Like, I don't think people realize how socially awkward I actually am in person. But if I get on the phone with someone, I'm gonna close 70, 80% of them or whatever when it gets to a proposal, because I know what I'm doing and I'm confident, and they can tell, listen to me, that, hey, this guy at least believes he can deliver.
Yeah, for sure. I mean,
is my sales technique.
the less you sell, the better. I'm incredibly bad at sales. I don't really follow like any like
High
sales
ticket, I agree.
methodology
Yeah.
or books. All I kind of do is I get on a call with somebody and I just ask them some questions that I would just need to know in order to work with them in the first place. And
exactly.
then on the ads front, I do video audits all the time on ads. They're incredibly powerful. Get access to the ad account. You can see exactly what's happening. 5 minutes of reviewing will give you like enough material for a 10-15 minute video. Send it off to them. And then my proposal is fairly straightforward. I don't need to break out in my proposal, here's everything I'm going to do for you, because the video already serves that purpose. And so then it's a lot easier if you do it that way. Where if you try to like hard sell somebody, like, some people have the personality, and that's great. I don't.
Yeah, but I find on this high ticket stuff, like, man, like, the better approach. I've tried being a little bit pushy, and granted, I'm not very good at it, so that probably could be why. But when I do the opposite approach, I'm just like, yeah, so this is the price, so we don't do discounts. And this is a 12-month contract. That's it. We don't have any other options. I don't quite say it like that. But it's like, you can take this if you want. I can send you this. You can have a look through it and decide on your own. And if you're not interested, then that's fine. We can refer you to someone else. But again, you're not saying it that way, but when you have that attitude, it converts better. People are more interested in working with you because, like, holy shit, this guy is confident. He must be really freaking good at what he does. He must have loads of clients if he really doesn't seem like he cares whatsoever.
Yeah, as long as it's authentic, it is possible to kind of hardball, if you will, and be very like strict, like, this is how we do things, and come off as like a bit of an asshole. And if you do it that way, then people aren't going to want to work with you. So it has to be something that you're able to deliver naturally. For example, we got on a call with somebody. We had kind of gone through the works of what we typically do on the PPC side of things, and PPC pricing tends to be a lot lower. So we were pitching them $500 a month to manage their ad spend based on what they were spending. And we get to the pricing, and they go, well, I was really looking for somebody about $300 a month. I said, okay, well, we charge 500. so like, it was like taken aback, because like most people expect you to sit there and like haggle. And when I was like, sorry, we charge like 500 for this. Got off the call. I sent him a copy of the proposal. I was like, hey, if you want to move forward, let me know. Nothing, didn't expect to hear from him. A couple weeks later, he then asked me a couple more questions, like, hey, when do you report on stuff? When do you bill me? Like some other questions. And eventually it just didn't work out, where we didn't want to work with that person at the end of the day, after we talked to him a little bit more. But like, we were firm on what we said. And at the end of the day, our services are going to be better for it. We price ourselves at that for a reason. If we're willing to work with that person for $300, then why aren't we pricing ourselves at $300?
Yeah. I think the point you made, which I agree with, is it works if it's real, if it's
Mm,
natural. If you're just faking it, then you may come across as arrogant, and it's not going to have the
yeah.
same effect. When it's a genuine thing where like that is really your price and you really will not drop that price, and you really do not care if they sign up because you have plenty of other leads, then because it's real, it's just straightforward. You're just telling them how it is,
Right.
which people kind of appreciate. Again, when we're talking business owners, people with business acumen, they actually appreciate someone that speaks straightforward and isn't BSing them or anything like that. But, and maybe that's different with smaller clients. But yeah, if you're faking that, then people can tell usually. So it doesn't
Yeah.
have the same effect.
Yeah, for sure. It's something that you'll learn over time. I mean, you have to be willing and able to screw up a couple
A
proposals. I
lot,
mean, there were,
in my case.
yeah, there were plenty of times where I was pitching 5K a month deals that honestly I wasn't qualified to charge somebody 5K a month. And
Yeah.
because of that, my skills weren't good enough to sell somebody on that. My skills weren't good enough to present a proposal like that. My skills probably weren't good enough to execute on that. And so we didn't close those deals. But then we figured that out, that we're not ready to be able to pitch these deals at a regular basis. Whereas now we're able to put together proposals at that rate and work with people at that rate, no problem, because we've gone through the ringer. We know that now people who we used to be able to take on can no longer afford us because
Yeah.
we have more costs now. We used to work with cheaper writers, and it's just like, here's what you get. Now it's a lot more complicated. Now it's the content strategy. Now it's creating an outline. Now it's getting it written. Now it's getting approved by the client. Now it's sending it to a developer to upload it to the website so it can be properly formatted, and any extra code that needs to be added in can be added in. It's a lot more complicated of our process, and because our prices, our costs have increased with that, certain clients aren't a right fit because they don't appreciate that. Where they're like, I don't care if you pay somebody 2 cents a word get on the site. I just care about seeing like a ranking go up. Versus those other companies that do appreciate that, that would never let you put anything on
Yeah,
their
yeah,
website
yeah.
without approval, without it matching brand, without it